Welcome to Dark Ascent. Today I'll go over a hike where a group of teenage boys set out on what they thought was just a spontaneous weekend trip. Growing up, they treated the Himalayas like familiar ground, not realizing that comfort can blur judgment when the terrain stops being forgiving, knowing how it ended on that Khumbu Ridge. It's kind of hard to believe how fast a normal decision turns into something you can't undo up there. It was October 12th, 2019. Autumn trekking season was in full swing across the Khumbu region, and a stretch of unusually stable weather had made the mountains feel more predictable than they really were. The four boys who showed up at the trail entrance that morning were from Namche Bazaar, a small mountain town in Nepal up in the Khumbu region, sitting around 11,300 feet above sea level. For them, the mountains weren't anything unusual. They grew up with them right there in front of them every day. Visible from school, from the streets, from basically everywhere. Big peaks like Tamsurku and Kongdari were just part of the background of their lives. So over time, it all started to feel normal, not something they thought about much, just something that was always there. And that kind of familiarity made the whole landscape feel less like something intimidating and more like something they already understood, even if they really didn't. Clyde Mortensen was 16 years old and a student at a local school. Teachers and family described him as capable and self-directed, someone who enjoyed fixing things and teaching himself mechanical skills through online videos. He navigated the steep local paths with ease, had some trekking experience with his family, and had developed a growing confidence in high-altitude movement. Within the group, he was generally regarded as the most experienced outdoorsman. His father worked in Kathmandu during the week, and his mother believed he was spending the weekend at a friend's house in the village. Preston Balin, also 16 years old, had been Clyde's closest friend since childhood. He was the largest of the four boys, standing just over 6 feet tall. His parents were away in the lower valleys for the weekend and expected only a routine check-in message, which he had already sent before the hiking plans were finalized. Setal Pangsha was the quietest member of the group, more observant than outspoken. He had recently developed an interest in photography after receiving a DSLR camera from a relative. His main reason for joining the trip was to photograph the autumn colors of the birch and rhododendron forests near Tengbosch, something he had been planning to do for weeks leading up to October 14th, 2019. His mother, working shifts at a regional clinic, believed he was staying at Clyde's house. Geyser Alcott was the least physically prepared for a long mountain hike. He had a lighter build and mild asthma, managed with an inhaler he did not always carry consistently. His parents maintained stricter rules regarding unsupervised outdoor activities, so he told them he would be spending the weekend at Preston's house. They expected him home for Sunday dinner. The ability for the group to make the trip without immediate parental intervention was not the result of travel distance or concealment, but rather the informality of supervision within a closely connected mountain community where short local hikes were common and often unrecorded. All four boys lived within walking distance of each other in the Namche Bazaar area, where short overnight plans into nearby valleys or ridge trails were a routine part of local youth activity during stable weather windows. In this environment, permission was often implied rather than formally requested, particularly for outings perceived as familiar terrain rather than structured expeditions. I think what gets me here is how normal it probably felt to them. It's not like they were sneaking off in some dramatic way. It's more like, in a place like that, you don't really sit down and formally run a hike past anyone. It's just going out for a bit and that's it. Each household operated under different levels of oversight, and communication between families relied heavily on assumptions rather than direct coordination. One boy's parents believed he was staying with another household, while others relied on expected check-in patterns that were typical for short weekend absences. Because the plan was framed internally as a brief local hike with a return before Sunday obligations, it did not trigger immediate concern or verification. No formal trekking agency, guide service, or lodge registration was involved in their departure, and there was no centralized system in place that cross-checked short local movements by residents within the valley. As a result, their absence initially blended into normal patterns of youth activity in the region, until the expected return times passed without contact. Clyde's mom was handling the week on her own and trusted that he could look after himself. Preston's parents were out of town and just relied on the usual check-in messages. Settle's mom was working shifts and didn't really have a way to double-check anything. Geyser's parents were probably the most strict out of the four, but even then, it was only supposed to be a short overnight trip, something that, if they had actually been asked, might have seemed normal enough to allow. But no one asked. It was just planned quietly over text on Thursday night, then pretty much locked in by Friday. And what really sticks with me is this. There weren't really any parents actively in that loop at the moment. It mattered. Not checking, not confirming, not actually there in the decision. Beyond Tengboshe, several lesser-used footpaths climb toward open ridgelines above the monastery. These routes are occasionally used by local hikers, herders, and trekking staff seeking higher viewpoints above the forested slopes. The trail continues beyond Tengbosch toward the upper Khumbu Valley, following established trekking routes that climb gradually toward high alpine viewpoints above the tree line. Local hikers sometimes refer to an informal ridge overlook above the upper valley, reached through a steep gain of roughly 3,000 to 3,500 feet, depending on the chosen approach. The lower section is forested and relatively well shaded, with a worn, established path from regular use. Between roughly miles 3 and 5, the terrain transitions as trees thin, wind exposure increases, and the landscape opens toward the upper Khumbu Valley. Above about 14,500 feet, the trail just opens up completely. No trees, no windbreaks, just open alpine ground. The vegetation gets really thin, and in some parts it turns into loose rock and scree, so every step actually matters a bit more. Navigation up there mostly comes down to stone cairns and painted markers along the way, because there aren't many natural landmarks once visibility drops, and the whole upper valley is basically this wide, exposed bowl surrounded by massive 8,000-meter peaks, fully open, and the weather can shift pretty fast once you're up there. I always find it a bit striking how quickly it goes from easy trail through forest to completely exposed ground. It doesn't feel gradual when you actually think about what you're walking into. In the days leading up to the hike, a high-pressure system brought unusually stable conditions for mid-October, with clear skies, light winds, and mild temperatures at village level. The group planned the hike within this window, which appeared consistent and stable on the surface. Weather forecasts distributed through trekking agencies and local lodges had indicated the possibility of deteriorating conditions over the weekend. Though the timing remained uncertain, it mentioned the chance of snowfall above about 5,000 meters, along with stronger winds on the exposed ridgelines. But the thing is, even though it was publicly available, it wasn't really passed along at the trailhead, and there weren't any closure signs up yet, or any staffed warnings in place when they set out. The group reached the Tengbosch Trail entrance shortly before 8 that morning. The trail was active but not crowded. Several trekking groups had already passed through earlier that morning, while others could occasionally be seen farther ahead along the route toward Tengboshi. The boys gathered their gear, paused briefly at the stone marker, and took a photograph together under clear skies and cool autumn conditions. The temperature was approximately 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Several permit checkpoints existed along the main trekking corridor, though local residents moving between villages often passed through that with less formality than visiting trekkers. The lower section of the trail wound through dense birch and rhododendron forest, with occasional meadows and dry seasonal drainage. The path was clear and easy to follow. Clyde set a steady pace while Settle stopped periodically to photograph the golden leaves. The others waited without complaint. The atmosphere remained relaxed, and they encountered no other trekkers as they climbed. By the time they reached roughly 14,000 feet, the effects of elevation and exposure had become noticeable. Temperatures had dropped into the mid-30s, though wind remained light. Geyser used his inhaler once after experiencing mild discomfort from the cold, dry air and sustained climb. The symptoms eased quickly, and the group continued. At one point, Clyde remarked that they were getting close to the section of trail he had been describing during the planning stages. He was referring to a ridge viewpoint above Tengbosch that he had seen in photographs and heard about from local hikers. His estimate of the remaining distance was optimistic, but none of the boys had previously reached that part of the trail, above 14,500 feet. The mountain changed abruptly. The trees disappeared, replaced by open alpine scrub and steady northwest winds. Temperatures were around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill reducing effective conditions to roughly 18 degrees. The boys were dressed for a cool autumn trek, but not for prolonged exposure at that elevation. The views were expansive. Golden forests stretched below the tree line, while the peaks of Everest and Lhotse stood out sharply in the clear air. Sadell photographed constantly, including a growing bank of clouds on the western horizon. Though it was the leading edge of an approaching weather system, it appeared distant and harmless from where they stood. This is the part that always feels deceptive to me, because everything still looks beautiful, everything still feels manageable, but you're already standing in conditions that are very different from what it looks like on the surface. Both Preston and Geyser commented on the cold after leaving the shelter of the forest, but neither suggested turning back. The group had already invested several hours into the climb, and the upper overlook felt close enough to justify continuing. Around midday, after more than 4 hours on the trail, they reached the upper overlook at approximately 15,600 feet. They were fully above treeline in exposed alpine terrain with no natural shelter. Winds had strengthened to an estimated 25 to 30 miles per hour. Temperatures had fallen to around 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind chill placed effective conditions near 8 degrees. The boys spent roughly 20 minutes at the overlook. Settle continued photographing until the cold drained his camera battery. Geyser was visibly shivering. Preston's fingers had gone numb, and Clyde found that his phone had no service. Eventually, the decision to leave required little discussion. They had reached their destination and seen what they came to see. The cloud bank to the west was noticed, but not treated as a concern. Expecting a routine return along the same trail, the four boys turned around and began their descent. Shortly after midday, snow began moving into the upper valley. The system had been forecast to arrive later in the afternoon, but it ended up reaching the area earlier than expected. In hindsight, that kind of shift isn't unusual for fast-moving storm systems crossing the Himalayas in October. The terrain can really mess with how fronts move and speed up their timing. The official forecast had already allowed for that uncertainty by giving a range instead of a fixed arrival time. But the key thing is the boys didn't have access to any of that information while they were out. Snowfall began lightly, with wind-driven flakes most visible against dark rock rather than accumulating on impact. Within minutes, it intensified, and roughly 20 minutes later, it had become heavy, horizontal snow that reduced visibility on the upper slopes to under 100 feet. The group was already on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line when visibility collapsed. Trail markers in this section consisted of stone cairns placed at regular intervals. In clear conditions, they served as the primary navigation reference, but in blowing snow and low contrast, they became difficult to locate. As conditions worsened, and early accumulation filled shallow gaps in the rock, the boys continued descending based on terrain memory and general direction, rather than confirmed visual markers. Once visibility dropped, they ended up drifting a bit off the main trail, maybe around 200 feet to the east. The problem was the slope there was just more exposed and steeper than the normal route, which is actually designed to be a more gradual, safer descent. And in that kind of low visibility, plus fatigue and altitude starting to kick in, it wasn't something they really noticed at the time. I know how quickly low visibility and keep moving turns into you've already left the safe line and you don't know it yet. As the afternoon went on, the wind picked up too, somewhere around 35 to 40 miles per hour. Snow started building up unevenly across the rocky slope, covering some surfaces while leaving others exposed. That made footing a lot worse. The snow filled in gaps between the rocks, so every step became less stable, and that just slowed them down even more and kept them out in the cold longer. Around this stage, Geyser's condition worsened significantly. He showed severe, uncontrolled shivering and reduced coordination, consistent with progressive cold stress. His breathing was strained by both exertion and thin, cold air, partially relieved but not fully controlled by his inhaler. The group slowed further to stay together, increasing time spent in worsening conditions at high elevation. Sometime later, the decision was made to stop. They took shelter behind a large boulder on the slope, one of several scattered across the rocky hillside. It provided partial wind protection, though wind continued to wrap around its edges. Visibility had dropped into near whiteout conditions, removing most terrain reference beyond a short distance. The boulder became a temporary anchor point in otherwise featureless terrain. Clyde attempted an emergency call from his phone, but there was no signal. He then composed a text message to his mother and another to a local contact in Namche Bazaar, describing their situation and his best estimate of their location. Neither message was transmitted. The attempt was later recorded in the phone log shortly after they took shelter. The 2 hours and 15 minutes that followed were the longest of the day and the least observable from the outside. There were no witnesses and no further communications. The boys remained behind the boulder as the storm moved fully over the ridge, snow accumulating around and on them, while temperatures continued to fall. Hypothermia doesn't really show up in a clean, obvious way while it's happening. It's more gradual and kind of messy from the inside. At first, it usually starts with shivering, and people can get a bit foggy or make worse decisions without really realizing it. As it gets worse, that confusion builds up, and even simple thinking or coordination starts to slip. I don't really know how else to say this, but hypothermia doesn't feel like a moment. It feels like small things slipping. You start shivering, you get slower, your thoughts don't line up cleanly, and you don't really clock how serious it is while it's happening. After a point, motor control gets weaker too, and the body just stops responding the way it should. Eventually, things begin to shut down in stages, and how fast it happens really depends on a lot of things. Wind, how wet or insulated the clothing is, how much energy the person has left, and just their overall condition going into it. At this point, the group was at approximately 15,600 feet on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line, in temperatures estimated between 20 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts approaching 40 miles per hour and heavy wind-driven snowfall. Their clothing was not sufficient for sustained exposure in these conditions. They'd barely eaten anything earlier, and by that point they'd already been exerting themselves at altitude for hours. That kind of steady shivering in the cold isn't just uncomfortable, it actually drains you faster than you'd expect, until you're just running on empty without realizing how far gone you are. Preston was the one who tried to move first after they stopped. He tried to help Geyser up and push downhill again, but he didn't make it far, maybe about 40 feet, before he just went down on the rocks. He never made it back to the boulder. After that, things get harder to piece together exactly. The positions they were later found in give a general idea of what happened, but not a precise sequence. Just enough to understand they were all collapsing at different stages, not all at once. I don't really know a softer way to put this. Once your coordination starts slipping up there, it's not like you notice it happening in real time. You just slowly stop being able to do simple things, and by the time you realize it, you're already behind it. By that point, they were around 15,800 feet up on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line, roughly 200 feet off the marked trail, in conditions that were steadily worsening with wind and driving snow. Geyser had been struggling the longest. He was found seated against the base of the boulder, knees pulled in, his inhaler in the snow just inches from his hand. Preston was found further downhill, face down on the slope, still away from where they had stopped. Settle stayed at the boulder. He was found seated against it, his camera bag still in his lap, like he never really left that spot once they got there. Cleed was found approximately 6 feet from Settle, lying on his side with his phone in his right hand. The phone screen was dark. A queued emergency text, time-stamped earlier in the afternoon, was present in the messaging log and had not been transmitted. The group was no longer on a clearly defined section of trail, but within an exposed alpine environment on a rocky slope above the tree line. Visibility had deteriorated to near whiteout conditions, and wind-driven snow had obscured terrain features and reference markers. I keep picturing it as their only windbreak at that point, even though it wasn't much, just enough to take the edge off for a moment. And once they stopped moving, the situation just settled into something worse without much resistance, like the storm finally caught up and stayed there with them. They weren't really sure of their exact position anymore. Movement had pretty much stopped, and all four of them were just stuck there in the cold, with the wind and snow still hitting them hard. And there wasn't any real shelter, no way to communicate out, nothing like that, just open high-altitude terrain, and the storm continuing to build around them. As weather conditions deteriorated later in the afternoon, no other trekkers were visible in the upper alpine sections of the route. No one observed the group leaving the village. No confirmed sightings of the group above the tree line were reported after the weather deteriorated. No distress signal was received or acknowledged. The checkpoint logbook contained no entry for the group. The quiet stone enclosures at the edge of the village remained empty through the evening. Overnight, and into the following morning, gradually accumulating snow. It was Geyser's parents who first identified that something was wrong. They expected him home for Sunday dinner, and when the afternoon passed without contact, his mother called Preston's house. The call went unanswered. She tried again later, with the same result. Geyser's father then walked to Preston's residence, where he found no one home. I keep thinking about Geyser's parents here, because it starts so normal, just waiting for him to show up for Sunday dinner like always. Nothing dramatic about it at all. By early evening, as calls moved between households, inconsistencies began to surface. Clyde's mother had not heard from him. Settle's mother believed he was staying with Clyde. Preston's parents, reached by phone while away, expected him home later that evening. Within a short period, it became clear that none of the boys were where they were supposed to be, and none could be reached. I keep thinking about how it doesn't explode into panic right away. It's more like small, specific calls that slowly stop matching up. Local search and rescue services were contacted later that evening after 4 16-year-old males were reported missing, last confirmed at the Tengbosch trail entrance the previous morning. A photograph posted from one of the boys' accounts, showing the group at the trail marker in clear morning conditions, helped establish their last known departure point. Ground teams reviewed conditions that night and determined that immediate access to the upper alpine zone was unsafe due to ongoing snowfall, wind, and darkness. Search operations were staged for first light. Shortly after sunrise, a helicopter search was launched over the upper valley, while ground teams began climbing toward the area where the boys were believed to have traveled. Conditions above the tree line were clear and cold, following the passage of the storm, with fresh snow covering the terrain. Fresh snowfall made visual detection difficult, but search crews eventually spotted a cluster of dark objects partially exposed on an exposed rocky slope above the tree line. Ground teams reached the site shortly afterward and confirmed all 4 individuals deceased. Personal items were found in situ, including a camera bag, a mobile phone, and a medical inhaler recovered near the victims. One individual was located significantly downslope from a sheltered position near a large boulder. Medical findings later attributed the cause of death for all 4 to hypothermia, with one case noting exercise-induced respiratory complications as a contributing factor. No traumatic injuries or toxicological factors were identified, and the incident was classified as accidental. Medical findings indicated the group succumbed to the hypothermia during the evening hours following the storm's arrival.